Origins Homes UX, and this is how NATO and Russia are preparing to fight total war by the channel Real Life Lore. Yeah, okay. Yeah, happy thoughts. Yeah, that title is insane. But I don't know. Is that where this is going? I don't know. Obviously, I'm not keeping up to what is happening with current events. Usually, my go-to source is like Real Life Lore, and now like Task and Purpose and other channels I added to it as well. But for long enough time was always Real Life Lore. So I don't know. When the Russia-Ukraine thing happened, people were just saying, okay, Russia is preparing. Russia is at the border. There are like hospital tents, and everybody's just like, yeah, maybe it's just like a scare tactic. Maybe it's just political thing. No, it's not. It was actually happening. So is this one of those things where we're gonna take it not that seriously? Holy shit, we are at war again, right? I've been watching a lot of like Poland thing recently. And I'm like, come on, man, really? Again with Poland? Give them a break, for fuck's sake. That's insane. Every time Poland gets screwed for some reason. Yeah, the Poland is preparing this. Poland is the next target. I don't even know what that is. I've been watching those kind of titles popping up as videos, like homepage and things like that. People talking about it, like what the fuck. So we'll see how this is gonna go, I guess. Yeah, that's always fun. Remember, if you like my reaction, don't forget to subscribe so that way I know which type of videos to react to more. I like, like geopolitics type of videos like this. It's, obviously it keeps you up to date and you escape the normal news media cycle, which is like always somewhat biased, right? Channels like this basically gives you like information that you should have. So I like videos like this, which basically keeps you informed. When I watch videos like this and then I watch some like mainstream news or something, in either way, you can always see the disparity, right? Like left wing being a bit left wing, right wing being a right wing, and you can see like how there is a difference. That's why I like videos like this. So if you like, the reactions like this, definitely like and subscribe. That way, the algorithm can be, like engaged or something. I don't know how that works, but yeah, that's what it's fun.
As the war in Ukraine has entered into its third year, the conflict continues to appear having no immediate end in sight. While Ukraine has largely defeated the Russian Navy, the war on the land appears to be slowly shifting against Kiev, while Moscow appears to be increasingly emboldened. In February of 2024, the Russians finally captured the city of Avdiivka, a major suburb of the city of Donetsk that had a pre-war population of more than 31,000 people, and Russian forces have been making a slow, creeping advance beyond Avdiivka ever since. An American foreign aid package for Ukraine worth $61 billion continues to be held up in the US Congress, while in March, Vladimir Putin secured his re-election in Russia for a fifth term as the nation's president, meaning that he will continue ruling in the Kremlin at least until 2030. Possibility of getting extended even further for a sixth term until 2036, by which point he will be 83 years old, not too much older than Joe Biden is today. Putin is already the longest-serving head of state in Russian or Soviet history since Joseph Stalin, and by the end of his current term in 2030, he will surpass Stalin. And if he serves out through 2036, he will even surpass the reign of Catherine the Great, to become the longest-serving head of state in Russian history since Peter the Great himself, the founder of the Russian Empire. With his political position as Russia's leader now,
there's always someone, right? First it's like, okay, he's gonna surpass Joseph Stalin. Like, oh, that must be the highest. No, wait a minute, Catherine the Great. Yeah, that makes sense. So that must be that. No, wait a minute, there's also Peter.
Secured for the rest of the decade, his greatest political opponent Alexei Navalny dead and silenced, and with a major terrorist attack in Moscow that his government is attempting to pin on the Ukrainians, there are whispers that the Kremlin is already preparing to roll out a second round of military mobilization in the country that'll seek to call up an additional 300,000 men for the war in Ukraine. Even without the mobilization, the Russian armed forces have been able to offer up attractively high enough salaries to poor Russians in the country, and to even poorer foreigners enlisted as mercenaries that they're...
Okay, what the hell, man? One thing I've noticed watching a lot of history videos, like 100,000, that number is big, right? Not many countries can just like pull up like 500,000 people to fight. These are like World War numbers, right? When it go close to 1 million or something, a lot of countries are involved. Okay, I'm pretty sure like what was the number like before, like 200,000 or something, and now they'll think of 300,000. That's like a 500,000 Russian right there in just Russia versus Ukraine war. How many soldiers does Ukraine have? That is insane. That 500,000 is a big number, man.
We're still seeing a fairly consistent stream of around 30,000 newly recruited soldiers a month to the front line in Ukraine, according to the website Ukraine Conflict Monitor. Despite suffering massive casualties in Ukraine, the Russian ground forces numbers present on the front line have been continually increasing with time. According to the Royal United Services Institute, a major UK think tank, the Russians have greatly grown their troop numbers in Ukraine, up from only around 360,000 soldiers at the beginning of 2023 to around 470,000 soldiers only a year later at the beginning of 2024. Putin himself has openly stated earlier this year that his plan is to raise the Russian troop levels in Ukraine up to approximately 600,000 strong, which will be more troops in Ukraine than the United States had present in Vietnam during the peak of the war in April of 1969. And in addition to raising its manpower for the war, Russia has also radically transformed its entire economy into a wartime economy, relentlessly refocusing most of its entire economic output on the war effort now. For the first time in its modern history, Russia's new updated—
Hold on, wasn't that the case in the first place? I mean, what is Russia's economy? It's usually gas and natural resources like that and military. That was the Russian economy before that, right? So it's just like, yeah, okay, focusing on military more, I guess. I mean, obviously, like natural resources, people are going to need that. They're still going to sell that, right? And now military is more, like amped up all the resources and things. That was already there a thing, right? I don't know.
Updated military budget for 2024 has soared upwards to a whopping 7.1% of the nation's total GDP, coming out to roughly 12.8 trillion Russian rubles, or approximately 140 billion US dollars in nominal terms. This places military spending at roughly 35% of the entire Russian government's budget now, and this massive new annual military spending has been signed into Russian law to last at least through 2024, 2025, and 2026. This is a huge 29% increase in Russian military spending from the year before in 2023, and it shows that Russia is deadly serious about shifting its economy to a wartime footing and pursuing—
Again, I don't understand that. Like, okay, Putin knew he was going to attack Ukraine. Putin is the last word, let's be honest, in Russian, economy and anything in Russian. So why didn't he do that a few years before? What, it would have ticked off people? Like, why are they suddenly spending 20% more in military? I'm guessing that must be the reason, right? It's like after war, they're like increasing the spending. They could have done that a few years ago. But if they had done that, US and everybody would have realized, like, wait a minute, they're preparing to attack something or something. They basically, made Ukraine into NATO country fast or some shit like that, just so. I think that was the reason, right? Because otherwise I can't, or maybe they thought like Ukraine thing is not going to last that much. In a month or so, Ukraine is going to fall or something. That's what they thought or something. But yeah, there is some element like that, but now they're increasing the spending.
Doing all of its military objectives in Ukraine to the bitter end. In purely nominal terms, the Russians are now spending nearly as much on their military as Germany, France, and Italy all are combined. But adjusted to purchasing power parity or PPP terms, the gap between Russian and European military spending is vastly closer together this year, with the Russians spending approximately $372.3 billion on their military, and every single European member state of NATO combined spending about $380 billion on theirs, placing Russian and European NATO defense spending on about an equivalent scale for 2024 in PPP terms.
How does that make sense, right? I don't know. Entire Europe, NATO, don't their economy can make more money? I mean, this includes France, Germany, and all that, even UK. So I think they can increase the spending to even 600 if they wanted to. Like, I think they're probably going to do that if they see like Russia is becoming stronger or aggressive or something, right? Because their economy is like much stronger combined.
As a result, Russia's military production levels are soaring. According to the Royal United Services Institute, the Russians are now on track to produce about 1,500 tanks for their army this year alone. About half of the total number they're estimated to have lost in Ukraine since the invasion began, and more tanks than are within the armed forces of the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden all combined. According to the Estonian Ministry of Defense, Russia is currently projected to produce roughly 4.5 million rounds of artillery in 2024 alone, and is also producing about 100 long-range missiles every month. On the 11th of March, CNN reported that the Russians were on track to produce 3 times more artillery munitions in 2024 than the United States and European NATO allies combined. And in addition to rapidly ramping up their own domestic production of munitions, the Russians are believed to have imported millions of additional rounds of artillery from North Korea and thousands of explosive kamikaze drones from Iran, with hundreds more being produced every month, which is how, according to the Estonian military intelligence, the Russians have begun to outfire the Ukrainians in artillery along the front line by a ratio of 7 to 1. Ukraine is currently struggling with acute shortages of both ammunition and manpower, a fact represented by the average age of the Ukrainian soldier on the front line being 43 years old right now. Historically, the Ukrainian government has only drafted men for the war between the ages of 27 at a minimum and 60 at the oldest in an attempt to conserve their smaller, younger generation as much as possible for the sake of the
I mean, if I saw the Federation video about like what a 30-40-year-olds can do in war, I mean, it kind of makes sense, right? But yeah, in today's world, I think 30-40 is not really old, even if maybe 40 is kind of pushing it, but 30 around, 30-35 is like physically task. I mean, it's not that different from 20-year-old. Obviously, 20-year-old would be like bit more, but I don't know, experience also like makes up for it or something.
country's future and economy. But as a result, Ukraine's draftable manpower pool has been made artificially smaller by effectively exempting men between 18 and 26 from conscription. And according to the AP, there's only around 300,000 heavily experienced but tired Ukrainian soldiers currently manning the front lines up against potentially twice as many Russian soldiers who have significantly more ammunition available to fire. In order to prepare for a widely expected renewed Russian offensive on the front lines in the summer, the Ukrainians recently amended their conscription law to lower the draft age for men from 27 down to 25, which will hypothetically open up a pool of an additional 400,000 new 25 and 26-year-old men for the war who can be conscripted from. But as Ukraine struggles to acquire more ammunition and manpower, and as Russia surges their own munitions and manpower on.
Okay, I don't want to pause too much, but where this is going, man, seriously, like, no other soldiers can really fight alongside Ukraine, otherwise, like, NATO is directly getting involved. That would be the issue. Ukraine literally have half of the men Russia has, and Russia has more equipment and ammunition. Even if Ukraine can get more, it's like half the soldiers. Like, I don't know, man. So far on their own turf, right? It's like the result has been like, you know, like even with more soldiers, Ukraine, even with Russia having more soldiers, Ukraine can still fight back. But how long this is gonna last, man? Right? This was what people were saying from the start. Like, I mean, Ukraine versus Russia. Come on, man. It's like in the end, result probably is gonna go through Russia's side, but with after how much damage, right? This is just fucked up.
Onto the front line to potentially overwhelm them, there is increasingly an amount of concern building that the summer of 2024 could end up becoming decisive and potentially disastrous for the Ukrainians. Putin and Russia's ultimate objectives in Ukraine and strategies to pursue those objectives remain uncertain in the dense fog of war. Nobody in the world, least of all myself, really knows what's going to happen next in Ukraine, and anything could end up potentially happening. But as it stands now, it seems fairly clear that Russia's priorities have changed very little since the opening days of the invasion more than 2 years ago. As a minimum goal, the Russians will almost certainly seek to expand their territorial control in Ukraine over all 4 of the Ukrainian provinces that they unilaterally declared to annex into Russia back in 2022, encompassing the entirety of the Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson provinces. Putin signed into Russian law recognizing all of these provinces as core integral territories of the Russian Federation, meaning that according to Russian law and the Russian perspective, as baseless as it seems to everyone else, the continued Ukrainian presence in these provinces is perversely viewed as a hostile occupation of Russia. And so the Russians will continue to try and drive them out as much as possible and force the Ukrainians into recognizing their total loss. In addition to demanding that the Ukrainians recognize the cession of these 4 provinces, the Russians will also want Ukraine to accept the previous laws of Crimea and Sevastopol as well. While it also even further appears that Russia will likely try and demand through military force or threats the additional annexations of the Ukrainian cities of Kharkiv and Odessa. Russian missile and drone attacks on both have sharply escalated in 2024, while Putin himself has frequently claimed them each to be supposedly rightfully Russian cities and labeled them both as priority war aims. As of the most recent 2001 census in Ukraine, both cities had majority Russian-speaking populations and significant ethnic Russian minorities that Putin's Russia now appears bent on directly incorporating. It therefore follows that in order to secure control over Kharkiv and Odessa, Ukraine's second and third largest cities no less, the Russians will probably also try and demand the further annexations of the Kharkiv, Mykolaiv, and Odessa provinces as a condition for peace as well. And all of them will probably see increased Russian military assaults eventually. It also stands to reason that if Russian advances on the battlefield are particularly successful, they will also likely attempt to demand the annexation of parts or all of the Dnipropetrovsk province as well, the final province of eastern Ukraine that has a large Russian-speaking and ethnic Russian minority, that Putin would likely attempt to claim as being supposedly rightfully Russian territory. Assuming that Putin is successful in his apparently maximalist objective of directly conquering, occupying, and annexing the eastern half of Ukraine with large Russian-speaking minorities, Russia's likely demands for whatever remains of the landlocked Ukrainian rump state will be no less neutering. The Wall Street Journal recently released an analysis of a 2022 proposed peace agreement that the Russians came up to enforce on Ukraine 2 years earlier that went nowhere, but its main points will likely still come up in the future if Russia manages to force a peace on its own terms. They will likely demand now, as they did 2 years ago, that whatever remains of Ukraine will be a permanently neutral state when it comes to military alliances, meaning that it will never be allowed to join NATO. The current administration of Volodymyr Zelensky would almost certainly be removed, and all new governments in Kyiv would have to be expressly approved by the Kremlin, essentially turning the remnant of Ukraine into another Belarus-style puppet or client state.
Yeah, I was about to say that. That's another Belarus, right? That's kind of was their goal from the start, right? They want these buffer states, basically, right? If they can get like old Soviet countries, with them, which I think in modern times they can't just like incorporate, even if that, I don't know. I think after all this kind of intense war, they will probably try to take the Ukraine as a whole, because it's like too much loss, too much in, like might as well now, right? Before, if if Ukraine surrendered really earlier, if that would have been the case, they would have probably done something like this, like Belarus, right? Like keep this former Soviet state as buffer states, so the border is not close to Moscow or something. That was the whole thing from the start. But now, I don't know. Now, if Russia wins, I think they will just basically take entire Ukraine in part of Russia or something.
State, highly dependent on Moscow for support. The original 2022 Russian proposed peace offer would cap Ukraine's post-war numbers of troops to only 85,000, while further limiting their tanks to just 342 and their artillery pieces to just 519, while outright banning Ukraine from importing any foreign-made weapons from abroad. The only notable concession that Russia has appeared willing to give the remnant of post-war Ukraine is allowing them to join the European Union, but never, ever NATO. None of this is at all a guarantee of what will end up happening in Ukraine, but it is what Russia likely wants to ultimately accomplish. And with the momentum of the war currently on Russia's side, it is likely what the Kremlin is attempting to push for. With their massive new military budget approved through 2026, the economy shifted to wartime, and a potential new round of mobilization coming, it appears that the Kremlin is setting a target date for victory in this war, with most or all of these objectives accomplished in Ukraine by the end of 2026, in about 2.5 years from now. Over these next 2.5 years, the Russians will continue trying to grind the Ukrainians down in a brutal, demoralizing, and costly war of attrition, in the hope that they will either steadily advance their own front lines militarily, or that the Ukrainian government will eventually concede for peace or get overthrown when the costs of the war become too great to bear. At the same time, Russia's special services will continue attempting to erode support for Ukraine in the West, so that the Ukrainian armed forces continue struggling with sources of ammunition and equipment, as the Russians dump more and more of their own ammunition and equipment onto their own side. And of course, even if this kind of a harsh peace was forced upon Ukraine by 2026, there is no guarantee that Russia would not seek to invade or further incorporate the rest of Ukraine into the Russian state in the future at a later time after it is rearmed and recovered. There is also no guarantee that Putin or Russia's territorial ambitions would suddenly just end with the total subjugation of Ukraine, just like how they didn't stop with the previous seizure of Crimea in 2014, or with the previous invasion of Georgia in 2008, or with the previous subjugation of Chechnya in 1999. Vladimir Putin now rather infamously said back in 2005 that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. At the time when he said it, there were very few people who actually believed that he would ever do anything about it. But here we are nearly 20 years later, with Putin still in power in the Kremlin and with his regime spearheading Russia's fourth war in the former Soviet world since he took over control.
I mean, look, man, during Soviet Union, like Russia had the most control. Now Russia has less control because there are less country in it. So you can obviously see, like, obviously that's what he's going to think, right? Anybody in his place is probably going to think like, oh, we have more, now we have less. So of course he's going to think like that, right? I mean, it kind of makes sense. Yes, but yeah, at the time, I'm pretty sure even he didn't know that he's going to do all this thing. I don't know. I guess over time he just realized, okay, I guess, I don't know what happens. It's like really hard to like, try to understand the mentality behind it. Like, now I have to attack for what reason? Is this the time he just he saw something that he just felt threatened by NATO or something? I don't know. Or something happened in the economy. It's like, oh, we have to take more or something. I don't know. So why around past 2-3 years and not before? Because he's been in power for a long time now.
They there is a clear, established pattern that Putin's ambitions in the former Soviet world will likely not end even if Ukraine is completely subdued in its entirety. And with the Russian economy now fully shifted to a wartime economy, the Russians will be economically incentivized to continue the wars after Ukraine too. If Russia were to eventually manage taking over full control of the Kherson, Mykolaiv, and Odessa provinces in Ukraine's south, it would establish a continuous land bridge from the Russian mainland to Transnistria, a deeply pro-Russian separatist region of Moldova that controls a narrow strip of land between the Ukraine border and the Dniester River, that has a population of around 365,000 people, about 30% of whom are ethnically Russian. Transnistria has requested direct annexation into Russia on multiple occasions since it secured its de facto independence through force and with the help of Russian troops that killed hundreds of people back in 1992. Around 1,500 Russian soldiers remain in Transnistria to this day as occupiers or peacekeepers depending on your point of view. And the Russians even went so far as to set up polling stations in Transnistria in March of 2024 that allowed Transnistrian residents to vote in the Russian presidential election for Putin, which sparked outrage in Moldova. As Moldova is neither a member state of the EU or NATO.
At that point, basically treating it part of like state of Russia or something. Like, oh, just vote for like Russian elections. You're part of Russia type of way. Of course, people are going to be like, whoa.
NATO and was itself a former Soviet republic for decades during the 20th century, Moldova is a highly vulnerable next target for Russia in the event that Ukraine collapses. The country has a very small population of only about 2.5 million people that is majority Romanian and a tiny standing army of only 6,500 personnel. Russia could end up repeating the same playbook that they've done previously in both Ukraine and Georgia, by recognizing the independence of Transnistria and then sending in the army with the excuse of protecting the ethnic Russians in Transnistria. That ends up with a complete Russian occupation of the whole of Moldova again, like back during the Soviet era. And in the process, the Kremlin will have restored its geographic frontier to the Carpathian mountain range in the south, securing its southern flank against NATO, who it perceives to be hostile. Moldova's current president is so alarmed by this possibility that she has openly stated that the Ukrainians are not just fighting for the future of Ukraine, but for the future of Moldova as well. Anticipating the risk, the United States has upped their defense assistance to Moldova by more than tenfold from pre-Ukraine war levels, from only $3 million a year in 2022 to more than $30 million a year in 2024. The US and France have also invested hundreds of millions of dollars into Moldova since the Ukraine invasion began to shift the country's energy connection westward, away from Russia to be more integrated with the EU instead. While France took things a step even further in March of 2024, when they signed a separate defense cooperation agreement with Moldova, which will establish a French defense mission in the Moldovan capital this summer and provides the framework for French military training of the Moldovan armed forces and intelligence sharing related to Russia. France's President Emmanuel Macron has even recently threatened to send French troops themselves to Ukraine in the event that the Russians appear to be imminently about to take over major Ukrainian cities again, like Kiev or Odessa. And Russia's probable ultimate ambitions extend beyond Georgia, Ukraine, Transnistria, and Moldova as well. In early 2023,
I'm not gonna lie, I don't know where it would go when two nuclear powers basically gets involved. That is like one of those points, right? Like when that does happen, it hasn't happened since like the first bombs were dropped, right? So when that does happen, right, what's going to happen? Are people going to take things slowly? Are everybody going to be like, okay, let's not use nuke? Or someone like Putin just will decide like, okay, might as well use nuke, otherwise, it sends the wrong message, like anybody can get involved type of way. I don't know. The deterrents are supposed to be deterrents, so I'm hoping nobody actually uses it. But I don't know. That's just fucked up.
A 17-page internal strategy paper related to Belarus, allegedly produced by Putin's presidential administration, was leaked by an international team of journalists. The paper details Russia's various strategies to essentially absorb and fully integrate Belarus into a so-called union state of Russia and Belarus by no later than 2030, at the end of Putin's 5th term in office. The paper details out the increasing Russification of Belarusian society, which has long been underway for decades now under the dictatorial regime of Alexander Lukashenko, who has continually remained in power in Belarus for 30 years now, ever since 1994. In the decade between 2009 and 2019, the most commonly spoken language by district in Belarus dramatically shifted from Belarusian to Russian, while Russian has emerged as the country's most dominantly spoken language over Belarusian, with fewer than 20% of Belarusians today citing the Belarusian language as their primary language spoken at home. While both Russian and Belarusian remain as the co-official languages of the Belarusian state, about 95% of the Belarusian government operates in Russian today, while the Belarusian language is almost totally absent in the state's education and media. Since the Russians helped to crush anti-regime protests that erupted in Belarus in 2020, Lukashenko's regime there has found itself heavily isolated and increasingly dependent on Russia for its very survival. Belarus already effectively functions as a Kremlin satellite state with Russian military bases on their territory. And since 2022, they've allowed the Russians to move their troops through the country to attack Ukraine from the north. And they've allowed the Russians to station tactical nuclear weapons in their territory as well. And as of early 2024, the Russians are believed to have massed around 40,000 of their own troops in Belarus with an unclear purpose. They could be there just to create a threat to Ukraine that forces—
I mean, come on, man. Now dominant language is Russian, like everybody's like, oh, might as well speak Russian. It is like a Russian, satellite state in a way. It might as well be Russia at this point, right? If it's acting entirely like a Russia, might as well held, election boxes should have been there, like who should be next Russian president in Belarus as well by that point, because it might as well be Russia at this point. Everybody speaks Russian. Everything happens there, whatever, Moscow wants, Kremlin wants. So there you go.
Kiev to keep troops deployed in the north and away from the actual front line in the east. They could also be building up to launch raids into northern Ukraine. Or they could even be building up to launch another major offensive on the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, just like they did in the opening days of the invasion in February of 2022. If Russia is successful with effectively annexing Belarus by 2030, like the paper leaked in 2023 suggests they are trying for, then the Russians will effectively incorporate the entire Belarusian military and all of its equipment and munitions into their own. Russia's military presence in Belarus will be dramatically expanded. The Belarusian intelligence service, still called the KGB, will be fully incorporated into Russia's FSB intelligence network, and Moscow will fully unlock Belarus's military, industrial, and manpower potential for the Russian war machine. There is therefore a potential scenario emerging that by some time later in the 2020s, the Russians will have occupied and directly annexed much of eastern Ukraine and turned the rest into a Quisling-style puppet state, occupied and effectively annexed Transnistria and potentially Moldova, and effectively absorbed Belarus. If this all comes to pass, then whatever remains of Ukraine will be almost encircled by Russian-controlled territory in Belarus and Moldova, and the amount of people directly under the control of the Kremlin will increase substantially more than what it's estimated to be today. Russia's population is presently estimated to be 144 million people without Crimea, and about 147 million people when including Crimea. Even though it's estimated that about 1 million Russians have fled the country since the invasion of Ukraine began, and US sources estimate that roughly 120,000 Russian soldiers have been killed in action in Ukraine, the Russians have also already absorbed millions of additional people from their conquered territories in Ukraine, including the estimated transfer of at least 700,000 Ukrainian children back to Russia. If the Russians gain more of their desired territories in Ukraine in addition to incorporating Moldova and Belarus, it's not inconceivable that Russia could emerge from this conflict in the later 2020s with a de facto population of between 160 and 170 million people under their control, which is not very different from the population of the Soviet Union at the beginning of World War II in January of 1940. If it emerges like this is a geopolitical entity that should not be underestimated by the West.
Yeah, but it was 1940. What was the global population back then? Is it really comparable, right? I don't know. Back then, 186 million was a big number. Is that a big number now? I don't know. I mean, big enough, I guess. I don't know.
If Russia emerges victorious in Ukraine by 2026, it will come out of it with by far the most battle-hardened and combat-experienced army in the 21st century world. With a significantly increased—
That's what I was thinking a lot. Every time I hear how China is becoming better and better, but China has no history of war, anything like that, inexperience. That's the thing everybody says, right? Everybody's inexperienced. USA is not inexperienced because they're always doing something somewhere in Middle East, this and that, right? Russia is having full-blown war against Ukraine, has been for multiple years. So if dust settles and Russia comes out victorious, that would be a scary element for anybody against Russia in the future, because they actively have experience there. They already have war machines going in, right? Their economy is military economy now, right? They know what the fuck they're doing. They've seen every any issue here and there. Every kings have been straightened out by now. It's one thing to be spending money, It's one thing to try to be prepared. Unless you are actually fighting the war, you won't see where the problems are. Russia would, they know what the problems are now. They would have ironed it out or something, right? So when the dust settles, Russia is going to be stronger in that way. People are really like, oh, Russia is no, Russia is paper tiger. Russia is this, Russia is that. Maybe you have a point, but Russia is slowly getting better, right? There's a reason why people always assume Russia and USA being two top military power, right? So they're slowly going there. So if Russia does win, right, Russia is going to be biggest threat to everybody like US and other countries, right? It's not just about technology; it's about tactics, right? How you like how you do your battlefield or something, right? How your generals are experienced or something. So yeah, that's insane. Like they will have real world experience that most countries don't have, if any countries have in modern time right now in 21st century.
Pool of manpower, resources, better geographic positioning, and a wartime economy that may not wind back down afterwards. And with Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, Georgia, and Chechnya all potentially secured by this point, will Putin's ambitions end? Or will their victory and the failure of the West to stop them encourage the Kremlin's eyes to turn to the remaining lost fragments of the old Soviet Union and what they refer to as the Russian world? The millions of ethnic Russians remaining in Central Asian states like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkmenistan. Or, more ominously, the roughly 900,000 ethnic Russians who continue to live in the three Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. All three of these Baltic states have a complicated and troubled history with their larger neighbor. All three emerged as independent republics after the collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917. But then, 2 decades later in 1940, during the Second World War, the Soviet Union invaded and conquered all three of them as a part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed with Nazi Germany. Each was then forcefully incorporated at gunpoint into becoming a Soviet republic, before the Nazis then invaded and conquered the region themselves the following year in 1941. The Germans then transformed the occupied Baltic states into their so-called Reichskommissariat Ostland, before the Red Army's major counteroffensive 3 years later in 1944 took them all back over again for the Soviets. The Soviets would then forcefully reincorporate the Baltic states back into Soviet republics, and went on to continue occupying them for the next half a century until the collapse of the Soviet Union itself in 1991. During that half a century that the three Baltic states were occupied and controlled by the Soviet Union, they were effectively colonized and their demographics were severely altered. The period of Soviet rule included mass executions, deportations, and repression of the native Baltic populations. Between 1940 and 1941, and 1944 to 1991, it's estimated that roughly 605,000 residents of the Baltic states were either killed or deported by the Soviets. Much of their property and belongings were seized and handed over to new Soviet colonists, as Moscow pursued a policy of Russification in each of them that included the suppression of the native Baltic languages and the promotion of Russian in their place. The Estonian city of Narva in particular was almost completely destroyed by the fighting of the Second World War. And after it came under the reoccupation of the Soviets in 1944, Narva's original residents were all expelled and not allowed to return, while colonists from the rest of Soviet Russia were brought in and resettled to the city as it was rebuilt. Before the war, Narva's population was roughly 65% Estonian as recorded by the 1934 census in the country. But in the latter half of the 20th century, the city's demographics were completely changed to become overwhelmingly non-Estonian. As a result, today in 2024, Narva is an overwhelmingly Russian-speaking city in Estonia. It is the third largest city in Estonia overall. Roughly 96% of the city's population are native Russian speakers, and a whopping 88% of the city's population are ethnically Russian too. It's also pretty much immediately across the border from Russia proper too. But even after their independence from the Soviets finally became a reality in 1991, they were all left over with very large Russian minority groups that lingered on afterwards, the result of the past half a century of Soviet rule and Russian colonization and settlement. Estonia and Latvia have the largest remaining Russian communities today, with ethnic Russians representing roughly a quarter of the total populations in each of them, with large Russian
I mean, that does kind of make sense, right? This is like less than I would have thought after all this time. So yeah, obviously this many Russians being still there is not. Yeah, it makes sense. I would, if you told me without showing this graph, I would have guessed more Russians because of everything that went through. But yeah, this is insane. After Ukraine, if like ambitions goes to like other Soviet states like this, I don't know, that might explode, right? I don't know, man. This is just Russia being like military state now in a way, right? Like war economy and everything. Yeah, if they're like okay, Ukraine is not the end point. What if beyond Ukraine, right? Moldova now this that I don't know where that would end basically. I have to I'm thinking both sides, right? Like maybe the world would USA, NATO, and world basically like oh that's enough, right? If you go beyond Ukraine, we will have to be involved, like France is saying. But also know the world can be like okay, let's just chill out. It's not our problem. Let's just chill out. They chill out all the way until it's like it's their problem now, right? Before it's too late. So I can see both sides, right? Russia just keep expanding until like all Soviet countries are part of them in however long or something, right? Or basically countries like France like oh hell no, that's yeah, we are the next threat, no, we're not gonna sit by, we're not gonna repeat the history or something. So I don't know where that's gonna go. That's just fucked up.
Demographics in cities like Narva and Daugavpils near to the Russian and Belarusian borders. One of Russia's primary arguments for invading Ukraine in 2014 and again in 2022 was based on the claim that the ethnic Russian minority in Ukraine was being supposedly persecuted by the Ukrainian government. And so it stands to reason that the same argument could be made at a later time for the large Russian minorities in Latvia and Estonia as well. Putin himself warned as much in January of 2024, when he said during a meeting that Latvia's treatment of their ethnic Russian minority constituted a national security threat to Russia itself. There is therefore a building fear rising that in the not-too-distant future, if Ukraine falls, the Russians could come storming into the Baltic states next, as they did before in 1940.
Yeah, but how long, right? I mean, how long it will take before Russia can even win against Ukraine? And how long before they can, like, do Putin have that many years left, right? He's like he said, in his 70s now, right? Soon he'll be in his 80s. I mean, people do live 100 plus, but is he going? If he doesn't live, like anybody besides him doesn't have the same ambition. This is all Putin, right? If anybody comes alongside Putin, would he be same as him, or would the Russia change as a whole, right? Because the only thing I can think of right now, everything that is happening is because of Putin, right? Putin has been there for multiple decades now. He's like molding this thing, right? Is there anybody who's ready to take Putin's place with the same ambition? Because all this is like in other like democratic countries, this is the case where the new president or new prime minister or whatever comes and their view is completely different, that type of way. Russia, Putin always wins obviously, but when Putin is not there, the guy who comes in probably not gonna have the same ambition. So Putin is targeting all these things. How does he know he's gonna be around to do that? Does he have backup plan or something, like when he's not there he's prepared somebody else to basically see his vision or something? Because I don't know how far he's seeing here.
Unlike all of Putin's invasion targets so far, though, all three of the Baltic states are members of both NATO and the European Union. And so a Russian military attack on them could trigger a massive military retaliation from the rest of Europe and the United States. But there is also the chance that it might not. It's well known that the NATO Military Alliance Charter includes a clause known as Article 5, which enables any NATO member state who is attacked to call on the rest of the alliance to defend them. But it is important to understand the very specific wording of Article 5, which reads verbatim, "The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, and consequently they agree that, if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense recognized by Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith individual..."
Assist. So they don't actually have to be there. They can just like give war supplies like US is doing.
And in concert with the other parties, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. With the very important phrase there being such action as it deems necessary, which means that if
assist can be anything. It doesn't need to be like including armed forces. So it doesn't say that it has to be like, okay, soldiers are there, right? So all article says like all the NATO members have to help. In which capacity? It doesn't like really say it, right? You can help by giving arms or something, like economical support or something. That's just okay.
Effectively, if one of the NATO states felt that sending a few first aid kits or helmets to the attacked country met the criteria for action that it deemed necessary, then that's all that's technically required of them legally. All of the members of NATO could choose to respond as rapidly or as slowly, as decisively or as cautiously as they each deemed necessary, essentially meaning that some would respond very strongly while others might hardly respond at all. And if Russia decided to test the solidarity of NATO in Article 5 with an attack on the Baltic states, it wouldn't have to be an all-out, full-scale invasion of them, at least not at first. Russia could one day test Article 5 by conducting a very limited invasion into Estonia, perhaps by stepping just over the border and seizing the Russian-speaking.
See, that's the thing. They can test, right? So they can try to test it, like what are they going to do about it, right? And that would be the like a pivotal point, because if NATO doesn't respond extremely harsh, like, oh, we told you like this is off limits, why did you attack NATO? Then anything's open, right? Anything's open to possibilities at that point. So that would be the pivotal point. If like somebody like, you know, like how France is being extreme right now, like, oh hell no, we're gonna respond. If France does that, that at least sends the message like don't touch NATO countries, otherwise everything will go to, I don't know. This is the problem, right? If two people fight, who's more hot-headed? And if both are hot-headed, everything's gonna go to shit. That's the problem here, right? If one uses nukes, one says like, I'm going to use nuke, other says I don't care, I'm going to use nuke as well. Both of them use nukes. That's the starting of the game fallout, right? Let's be fucking honest. So that's just insane. So two NATO countries, two nuclear powers fighting, that's going to be too stressful a situation. All right, well, that's it for now. I'll pick it up next time, I guess, if YouTube allows me or something. I don't know. Sometimes videos like this, especially from RealLifeLore, YouTube like, oh, hold up there. And last video, I made the second part. Put up for reviews on YouTube, like still didn't pass. I'm like, fine. But I need to find some other medium to put, the reactions that I can put on YouTube or something. But yeah, this was how NATO and Russia are preparing to fight total war. Watch on RealLifeLore. If you like my next one, subscribe, and yeah, I'll see you next time.